To begin for this morning, as I said, we have a panel of presenters on complaint systems and how they can support professional associations in delivering professional standards regulation to continuously improve standards of competence and conduct and to deliver consumer protections. Our first panel speaker will be John Vines, the chair of the Professional Standards Councils. John is an engineer by profession and has been leading the Professional Standards Councils as chair, as the senior Victorian member of the councils. John has worked extensively across associations and in regulation in professions, and he will be introducing you to the council's new strategic plan and the position of complaint systems within the regulatory framework under professional standards legislation.
So in opening the Professional Standards Forum, I'd firstly like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So what are the Professional Standards Councils? The councils are independent statutory bodies established in each state and territory with powers to approve and supervise schemes for occupational associations which limit the civil liability of association members. Each council consists of a chair, a deputy chair, and members appointed by the minister responsible for the administration of the professional standards legislation in each jurisdiction. And the membership of those, each jurisdictional councils is the same. So that provides for consistency across the nation. So what are the professional standards schemes? Consumers use a variety of services provided by a range of expert advisors. There is generally an expectation that these services will be accessible, affordable and of a high standard. When these expectations are not met, there is further expectation that there will be somewhere for consumers to seek redress. In an article for the Council's Research Library, John Cello, Justine Rogers and Dimity Kingsford-Smith helpfully describe these expectations in the concept of professionalism. And professionalism is characterised by professional standards and norms, and vitally, the adherence to those standards and norms. An integral part of maintaining an appropriate level of professionalism is the role of the professional association. As Dr. Justine Rogers and Deborah Harstein record in a report commissioned by the councils on, quote, the value of contemporary professional associations, the work of professional associations directly and indirectly protects consumers of professional services and supports the advancement of a profession as a whole. This protection is clearest in association standard setting and continuing training for competent, productive, ethical and empathetic professional service delivery. It is clear in professional associations work that dealing with consumer complaints and disciplining members is a critical component. The councils consider an association complaints system to be an essential part of its risk management system, which is a mandatory consideration before approving a scheme. The professional standards legislation provides a model code for complaints and discipline systems, which, from the council's perspective, sets out a minimum standard. The council's assessment of the efficacy of the consumer complaint system helps councils to consider the likely effectiveness of the association's risk management strategies and the means by which those strategies are implemented, which is our statutory obligation. The council's assessment of an association's consumer complaint system focuses on three questions. Does the system address and reduce consumer harm? Does the system improve professional standards? Is the system sufficiently integrated with other required elements of the association's professional risk management strategies to provide reasonable assurance of consumer protection and professional standards improvements? What we're interested in terms of the scheme application process and the scheme's operation are the aspects of an association's systems that are pertinent to a consumer's ability to make a complaint. We want to see practice-focused, input-based evidence of how the complaint system is implemented by an association and outcome-based evidence of its efficacy to protect consumers and continually improve professional standards. This is regardless of whether the association's complaint system is an internal or an external one.
To take us from theory and the legislation to practice, I'd like to welcome Andreas Haggard to the lectern to present the work of the New South Wales Bar Association. Thank you, Andreas.
So, bullying and sexual harassment in the legal profession. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this because I think everybody in the audience is aware of all the work that's gone on, not in the legal profession, but also across many of your professions. This is a problem which has been endemic to most professions for quite a long time. This infographic is from the International Bar Association's survey of legal practitioners. It was done in 2019. It talks about where they have experienced sexual harassment or bullying in the workplace, and the numbers there really speak for themselves. 1 in 2 female respondents had experienced bullying in the workplace, and 1 in 3 men. And with sexual harassment, it's 1 in 3 women and 1 in 14 men. Those numbers speak for themselves, and I won't dwell on them, but it's quite clearly a significant issue from a regulatory perspective. One of the other really significant problems about this conduct is that it's not reported. So the 2019 IBA study showed there the number of people who had not reported, and my memory of that study is that these are people who didn't report it to anybody. These are not people who don't report it to the regulator. They're people who don't report it at all. They just experience it and get on with it. And this was borne out by a follow-up study that they did in 2022, this year, I think, which looked at the number of reports received by regulators. And so I think they approached 70 regulators. And this, I think, is an extremely concerning infographic when you look at it, and doubtless some of the people here have experienced this. So this slide shows the number of reports received. It's the first noteworthy thing is that of the 70 that were approached, less than half actually even responded to the survey, which suggests that there isn't possibly even much data on what's being kept. But if you look at it, there were 10 of those regulators who didn't receive any, 12 who had less than 20, and then 3 who had more than 20. So when you're looking at a prevalence, as described in the 2019 stats, and that level of reporting, it's pretty clear that this conduct is not finding its way to the regulator. There are what I would describe as some traditional mechanisms by way of which we undertake our regulatory task. So the first one is about continuing professional development and standard setting. Many of your professions, definitely including the legal profession, we also set those standards right at entry. So that's the first point at which we can set a clear standard across the board. And then largely we use continuing professional development to drive change where we need to update those standards or highlight particular things. That's what many of your schemes no doubt do. And then if you look at the third limb there, as previously discussed, well, how do we find out what the regulatory risks are? We look at our complaint systems. So it goes without saying then that where you have a regulator that is not receiving complaints about conduct, which is widespread across a profession, it makes it extremely difficult to undertake that general exercise that you do where you use your complaint systems to identify what the risks are and what your detailed and specific responses might be. In looking at this, I've put there kind of a second limb of work, and this is largely what I'm going to talk to you about today, but I'm going to circle back to the first limb as well, and how the two interact. So the Bar Association commissioned a report from some academics at Griffith, which we now call the Griffith Report, which is not publicly released, but really underpinned a lot of the research and the sort of theory behind a lot of the activities that we have rolled out. And it really looked at how you harness informal reporting and complaints, and also use that to make sure that people or consumers or victims or people who experience this conduct are receiving support. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about now. So we have introduced, and we haven't done this alone, we have introduced a number of measures that are aimed at providing informal ways for people to access support, get information about what their options are under formal complaint handling processes, and also access welfare and support who experience it. So our work is not done, and any problem like this, which is so endemic, is going to take a long time. What I would say is I think having spent pretty much my entire career thinking about regulatory systems and what's effective, and having done an awful lot of legal policy reform, my reflections on all of that time is that the law ultimately, although extremely important, is words on a page, and the individual decisions that people make as social beings are not extremely influenced by it. There is a huge cultural shift that we're going through at the moment, which I think will be of significant assistance to us. And I think it is beholden on us to take this opportunity as this cultural change is happening at a societal level to really press and use all of the regulatory levers that we have at our disposal to ensure that our profession is able to really take advantage of that change and make that change across the board. I think that's it from me. I think I'm probably out of time. Thank you very much.
We'll now go from the pathways for complaints, formal and informal, to the data that they generate and the insights that data can provide for regulators in determining how to respond to the issues across competence and conduct for a profession. I'm delighted to be able to invite Marie to the lectern to give her presentation.
Whenever I look at these lists of most trusted professions, which are put out pretty regularly, I'm struck by how many of the most trusted professions are regulated professions. Some of you may recognise your own profession on that list. And John certainly spoke about the importance of practitioners being worthy of the trust that is placed with them. So regulated professions are highly trusted by the public, and yet you can open a newspaper on any given day and you will see really profound breaches of that trust. In my work as a practitioner, it sometimes feels as though complaints are quite random events, as though at any time a patient or a client might make a complaint about you, and that sometimes complaints can come out of the blue. And yet, in my work as an advisor to regulators, it seemed as though the same names were often coming up time and time again. And those of you who work in regulatory roles will be familiar with this phenomenon, where you actually begin to recognise the names of these frequent flyers who are incurring, I can see lots of nods around the room, who are incurring multiple complaints. So that was a really interesting paradox for me, this feeling that complaints feel like random events to individuals, but perhaps at a systems level, there might be some patterns. So being a researcher, I thought it would be great to look into that. I looked to some of the work that had been done overseas. Jerry Hickson at Vanderbilt has this wonderful phrase that it doesn't rain on everybody equally. Some practitioners have a malpractice dark cloud. So we put together a multidisciplinary team of researchers to try and find out whether that's true, whether in fact some practitioners are practicing under a cloud. I'm very grateful to the people who have funded this research over the years, including the National Health and Medical Research Council, the Legal Services Board and Commissioner in Victoria, CPA Australia in Victoria, and AHPRA. And I have to say that Australia is in the wonderful position of having some of the strongest regulatory data sets in the world. So we began looking at doctors initially. This was really the slide that began to change everything for me. So we found that fewer than 5% of doctors in Australia account for nearly 50% of the patient complaints. Fewer than 5% of doctors account for nearly 50% of patient complaints. And I think that as a regulator, that is a number that should potentially change the entire way that you go about your work as a regulator. We wondered if that was an Australian phenomenon, so we looked to the United States and we found that 1% of physicians in the United States accounted for about 1/3 of the paid medical malpractice claims. So there was certainly that strong clustering that we were seeing in other countries as well. We wondered if this might just be true about the health professions, and we began to look at other professions. And we found that fewer than 5% of lawyers account for nearly 60% of the complaints to the Legal Services Board and Commissioner. And then when we looked to accountants in Victoria, again, a very similar pattern of clustering was evident. Judging by the nods around the room, it seems that this framework seems to be resonating with many of you who are involved in professions outside of the 17 professions that we studied, and hopefully it gives you some greater insights into the characteristics of some of those highly complaint-prone practitioners. And I guess the next question is, well, what do you do about it? Within the health sector, we really love risk scores. So some of you may have been to the GP and had a risk score done to estimate your risk of a heart attack or a stroke or breast cancer. And so what you can do is, once you've got good data on all of these different risk factors, you can put them all together into a risk score, which can estimate the probability of a bad thing happening to a particular person. So we wondered if that might be possible within the regulated professions, whether it might be possible to take all this information we had gathered from the regulators' data and put together some kind of a risk score. And it turns out that it is possible. So we developed something called the PRONE score, which is the predicted risk of a new event. And you can see here that if you take a practitioner who has a PRONE score of 1, so for example, that might be a female physician who's young and has just received her first complaint, there's a less than 15% chance of another complaint within 2 years. So in that instance, the appropriate response from the regulator might be to focus on that individual complaint, to resolve the individual complaint, and to support the practitioner to get on with being probably a very capable and competent practitioner. Whereas if you have a practitioner who's got a PRONE score of 17, so that might be an older male plastic surgeon who's had multiple previous complaints and it's been less than 6 months since their last complaint, they would have a much higher PRONE score with a 90% chance, more than 90% chance of another complaint within the next 2 years. So as a regulator, you might approach that very differently and think that actually your focus in that situation doesn't need to be on just the individual complaint, but actually what you're going to do to intervene with this practitioner to keep the public safe and hopefully try and prevent them from continuing on this trajectory, which is quite likely to lead them eventually having to leave the profession. So you can actually take that data and calculate these scores. So what does this mean for all of you in the room? I think the most important takeaway message is that you are sitting on a wealth of information in the data that you hold, and that data can be used both to protect the public, but also to identify practitioners who are on a trajectory to careers of misconduct and hopefully support some of those people back into safe practice. I think that there are really incredible opportunities for regulators to be more proactive, to learn from this data, and to be able to support a more effective and trusted system of regulation. Thank you.